Hello everyone, I'm your host Joel Bryce, and welcome back to another episode of Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. On today's recording, I'm joined by world-class wildlife and hunting photographer Gary Kramer to discuss his new book called Waterfowl of the World. Over a 3.5-year period, Gary traveled the globe to personally photograph all 167 species of ducks, geese, and swans found on this planet. In addition to some fun storytelling, we discuss Gary's impressive professional career that spans from the military to a 26-year career as a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to professional wildlife photographer, international wing shooter, global traveler, and tour guide. You're going to enjoy every bit of our discussion. With that introduction, let's bring in today's guest. Gary Kramer, how are you doing today?
Hey, we're doing great. I appreciate being here.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. This was kind of short notice. I think I just reached out to you a couple days ago and happened to catch you in between your world travels, and happy to have you on the podcast. You're in California. Is that that's my understanding?
Yeah, at the moment here, I live in Willows, California, about an hour north of Sacramento, right in the middle of the Central Valley. One of the good things I have is a whole bunch of waterfowl habitat right around me.
Yeah, that's great. That's I think that's two things that we have in common is a love of waterfowl, and well, that's one thing. Two things is adventuring. You're quite the global traveler, and I think that's not to bury the lead, but we're here to talk about an amazing book, an amazing experience that you have available called Waterfowl of the World. Right? That's the title.
Yeah, correct. Waterfowl of the World. Huh?
Okay. Now it's inside this book. It's all 167 species of ducks, geese, and swans on the earth. Did I cover that correctly?
Yeah. It's there's 167 full species of, as you said, ducks, geese, and swan, i.e., waterfowl, worldwide. And that was my quest, was to get out there and photograph all of them. It ended up with a book that's 540 pages, 1,299 photos, and the thing weighs about 8 pounds. So it's a monster thing.
Well, with that big of an accomplishment, it better be heavy, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and you know what? We're going to learn about Gary Kramer, but before we get there, I just want to make sure people know how they can look at this book. I haven't had my hands on the book itself, but on your website you have sample pages, and that's pretty impressive. But they can go to garykramer.net, and that's Kramer with a K, right?
Correct, yeah, garykramer.net. And then they can go, then you click on books, and it'll come up as the first 2 books. And then you can take a look at both the cover, of course, the write-up on the thing, a bunch of sample pages, and then it's real easy. You can just click on a PayPal button, and bingo, you have it.
Awesome. We're going to talk about the book in great detail, maybe some of your adventuring, the photo collection that you went through, and what led you up to that moment. But again, like I said, one of the traditions on this podcast is I want people to learn, but we also want people to learn who our guests are. And so let's get to meet you, Gary. I've known, leading up to this podcast, I told you that I've known who you were as a world-class photographer, but preparing for this podcast, reading your bio, again, on your website, garykramer.net, and then just talking to some of my colleagues, I'm actually, I think I have a man crush, Gary, of all the different things that you've done with your life, and there's so much there. So I was honestly surprised to learn of the entirety of your background. So if you're ready, let's get into it. So a couple of the high points, I see military vet, 26 years as a wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, global traveler, I'll call you a tour guide of sorts, and an international wing shooter. I know I didn't cover it all, but Gary, let's start from the beginning. Where are you from? Kind of describe your upbringing. Were you a hunter as a child, or were you new to that?
Well, I actually, of all places, I grew up in Los Angeles, right about 2 miles from the LA airport. And as you look at Los Angeles back in the day, today there's no wilderness nearby, and there wasn't any then. But the only wilderness really that, if you really look at it, is that the ocean, when you live in Los Angeles, the ocean is kind of the only wilderness. And I kind of got started in the outdoor field. My dad didn't hunt or fish, but my grandfather was a big ocean fisherman. So starting when I was, 8 or 9 years old, I'd go out fishing on the party boats with him. And that's how I got going. And then once I could drive, organized a couple of my buddies, and I said, hey, let's go out in the desert and shoot a rabbit or two. And that just evolved fairly quickly once I could drive into some bird hunting, and then duck hunting became the most interesting. And surprisingly enough, within about a 4-hour drive of Los Angeles, there's some state and federal public areas that you can hunt on. So that's where I got my start with the hunting, and then that led from there into, I was at the age where you better do something or you're going to get drafted during Vietnam. So I joined the Navy, spent a couple years there, got out, and go, what am I going to do with my life? So I started looking at college catalogs, and I discovered that there was actually some degrees in wildlife biology and wildlife management. So I did all my education after the military on the GI Bill, went to community college for a couple of years, and then transferred to Humboldt State in Northwestern California, where I eventually got a degree in wildlife management for my bachelor's. I stayed there, and then I started a master's degree, which I ended up selecting Black Brant in Baja California at San Quintin Bay for my graduate studies, which I accomplished after a couple years down there, back and forth between California and Mexico. So it's kind of been waterfowl from the beginning for me.
Well, like you said, it's a pretty great waterfowling area, at least where you currently live, and it sounds like it was where you grew up. So that led, once you brought us up through your, earning a couple degrees, but then you worked for a pretty long career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service before, sounds like early retirement. What were those positions, Gary?
Yeah, what I managed to, when I got out of school, I ended up working for the Bureau of Land Management for 1 year. And that was because the agency I was really interested in, which was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, really wasn't hiring. So I got into the Department of the Interior, and after 1 year, I could start applying to Fish and Wildlife, which I did. And my first position was as the refuge biologist, waterfowl biologist at Kern Refuge in California, kind of in Southern California near Bakersfield. I was there for 3.5 years, and then I transferred to San Luis National Wildlife Refuge, also as a wildlife waterfowl biologist there. I worked mostly on private lands, did that for another 3.5. Then still staying in California, which is relatively unusual for a federal system to remain in the same state. Then I was selected as a refuge manager of the Salton Sea National Wildlife Refuge in southeastern California, down in the desert. And that was my first management position. So I transferred from a biologist to a manager, which was relatively unusual in those days to make that kind of leap. Normally you went through an assistant manager first, then a manager, but I was able to make the transition. Did that for 5.5. And that was an interesting place. There was a waterfowl there, endangered species, probably the hottest place in California to live, but I still enjoyed it. Then I transferred to Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge, which is a complex of 6 different refuges, quite a large operation here in the Central Valley. And then I did that for 10.5 as the manager there. And then there was an early retirement opportunity where you could have 26 years or 25 years of service at any age, and you could go out early. And I had already been starting some of my writing and photography on the side. I did that as a side deal to my Fish and Wildlife Service job. So I looked at that and said, well, I can take an early retirement, still get an annuity pretty quick, and then really test out this other thing that I had been doing part-time. And that's how I kind of landed from being a full-time, either a wildlife biologist, waterfowl biologist, or refuge manager. And I was photographing on the side and writing some stories for outdoor magazines, most of them eventually. Sending photos to Delta and a lot of the other publications. And then I made that jump, and then I went into it full time. And then that allowed me the extra time, instead of just on vacation and on weekends, I could really focus on this. And then that's what I've been doing now for quite a long time. So I've been pretty fortunate that I've had 2 careers, really, I'm so fortunate that I've had 2 careers that I loved each one of them. There was my service career was as good as I possibly could have wanted it to be. And then what's transpired since is equally as good. So I feel pretty blessed in that regard.
No, that's I've said this before on other podcasts. I hear someone else's story, and I hope when I at some point I can describe, the path that I took through my career, and it'll excite other people. But, I think, Gary, it's pretty impressive, the different things that you've been able to do, and Gary, all the things that are yet to be done. Where did the interest in photography start, or where did that come from?
Well, when I first started writing stories while I was still working for the service, it was kind of one of these deals that I had this hobby, fishing and hunting. But I quickly said, well, I wonder if I could write a story. I've been reading the outdoor magazine since I was a kid. Instead of comic books, I was reading Outdoor Life, Field and Stream, and so on. So I wrote a single story way back in the day, and I sent it to a magazine, to Western Outdoors, which is no longer in existence. And lo and behold, it was published. First try, sent it. It was a trip down into Mexico, doing some fishing and hunting, sent it. And then I wrote another one not too long after that, which was based on my work at San Quintin on brant. It was actually a brant hunting story. And the editor of the magazine called me up to interview me about the brant at San Quintin. And about halfway through, he said, look, you know more about this than I do. Why don't you just write the story? So I did that. But then very quickly, I found out that if I wanted to sell articles to outdoor magazines, if I could supply the package, which was the writing and the photos together, they generally didn't pay any more money. But the fact is, your chances of publication were greatly increased. So I said, okay, what I got to do from today, taking just a few shots, I need to really expand my photography into it, which I slowly did over a number of years, and eventually, got a big telephoto lens and found not only could I have hunting photos, but if I had, for instance, I was doing a story on whatever, duck hunting at Salton Sea. And instead of just hunting photos, if I had some photos of the common ducks down there, pintail, green-winged teal, whatever, that would really enhance the article. So I started to do that. And I found that was very, very good because the editors liked the fact that I could do some writing. I'd get the hunting shots, the grip and grin, with the dead birds, but also I could scatter some live bird shots in there. And that seemed to be the combination that really kind of launched my outdoor writing career, was being able to do both. And I kind of stuck with that over the years, and I ended up with several books as a result of that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. So what is the mix between, I guess, your current work? What's the mix percentage-wise between writing and straight-up photography? Do you still mix the two together, or have you
I
shifted?
still mix the two, but what I've found over the years is that writing to me is something that's a necessity, and it's something that I do on a regular basis. But photography is really my passion. So kind of what's happened is I still write quite a bit. Certainly with this book, for instance, this book has, it started out as a photo-driven coffee table book, but it ended up that. Plus the fact is that biological information on every species in the world is available. So it became a biological document as well that was peer reviewed by other biologists and experts in the field. So it really became both. So I still do lots of writing, but when I get up in the morning, I'm not saying I'm going to look forward to writing this chapter, but when I get up in the morning and say I'm going to go take photos, then I look forward to that day. So, I still do both, but the photography is really where my focus is these days.
That's your creative expression, sounds like.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And boy, Gary, I don't even know where to start. I do think, again, go to GaryKramer.net. Yes, and spend time on his website. I just, looking at the awards and accolades, you have a long list of Outdoor Writers Association of America awards for your photos. Many, many, many first place entries going back for many years, and so it's obviously something that you love to do, and you're good at it, and that's your peers have told you likewise.
Well, that's something I'm pretty proud of, and it's something that I'll never retire. I'm one of these guys that's going to keep going forever. I can't imagine not getting up. How many days a year I put waders on and go to marsh? A lot, and I want to continue doing that. So I'm fortunate that way that I can stick with it, and somebody has noticed that, and somebody pays me once in a while for the photos, and I can keep moving forward.
Yeah, Gary, one of the things I find funny is I have a 15-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter, and so with my 15-year-old son, I feel like I'm talking to myself sometimes, and myself at 15 didn't listen to what adults were telling me. I was kind of one of those kids that had to learn it, and I think you hear if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. I don't think that really rings true until you're at an older age. So I don't think you have a job. You just have a paid hobby. How's that?
Hey, there you go. Well, that's exactly how it started. It was a paid hobby, and I've been able to move that forward for a lot of years now. So that's a pretty good thing.
Okay, and I keep pushing the book back because there's other subjects that I think are fun to cover. On your website, trips. So you can click on the word trips, and so it looks like you organize birding, sightseeing trips all around the globe. Is that right, Gary?
Yeah, kind of what's evolved in the after I retired it was writing and photography, and a lot of just straight up photography that I sell directly to magazines. But what evolved over the years is that I went to so many of these places because I love to travel, and I went to many places around the world to whether it be bird hunting in South America like Argentina or in South Africa, and I got very used to doing that. And then people started to say, "Well, guy, you've been to Africa 5 times or however many, and what about putting a trip together?" So, back quite a long time ago, I started to put these trips together to where I would use the contacts I had in that particular location. And this is mostly all game viewing. It's like an African safari.
Mm-hmm.
I do an African safari. I do multiple ones, actually. I do the Galapagos, which is mostly birds, but there's lots of wildlife there. I do the Pantanal in Brazil for jaguars primarily. And then I do India for tigers. So I kind of developed this of putting these whole packages together, and what they become are escorted trips. So instead of somebody wanting to go to Africa on safari and just going to a travel agent, not knowing exactly what they're going to get, I mean, in reality, what happens is I book everything except for the international air. If we're going to Kenya, for instance, they need to get to Nairobi and home from there. And then from that point on, it's like I'm meeting them in person. We'll do the whole safari and then come back. And I think that kind of has resonated with people, is that, there's somebody there that knows the ropes that can show them. And all my trips are wildlife oriented. It's not like getting up at 7 o'clock, having breakfast at 8 and going out at 8:30. I mean, I'm up at sunrise. We're in the field early, and that's when all the action happens. So that has evolved to where it's a fair percentage of my business now. I don't know if it's quite half, but I bet you it's 40% of what I do. So and then of course, those trips take about 2 weeks each. So I space them over the year, and then I can do my other stuff in between. So that kind of works out too.
That's really interesting, Gary. I suppose your professional background, or at least your training, as a trained wildlife biologist or manager, that must help people feel more confident going on a trip. Other than word of mouth, I think that must help people. Hey, I have a trained biologist here that's taking me on this, wildlife viewing opportunity.
Yeah, no, it really has worked out for a lot of things. It's worked out with the game viewing, the wildlife viewing, because not only do the people have some comfort level that they're dealing with, I've been to these places lots of times, plus the background, but also the people that I deal with in the country, the outfitters, the drivers and so on, they recognize the fact that, I'm not some tourist that's going to go there once and I'm going to have repeat business. And then I kind of know what I'm talking about. So on both ends of the spectrum, it really makes both in country, the people I'm dealing with, and the clients pretty comfortable in both regards.
Okay. So my next question, Gary, do you have like really big suitcases? Like,
yeah, and I wear them out all the time.
Like really big, like I'm like 6'1", 180. Do you think I can sneak in one of your suitcases?
Yeah, well, they can't weigh more than 50 pounds, so you're dead there.
You have to cut me into pieces. But yeah, you said that you were, chasing, upcoming here, you're chasing peacock bass, and I thought that's a bucket list item there, Gary. So I guess I'm not going to fit in your suitcase. I'll have to go on my own.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So so let's switch to the book. I think we could probably spend hours talking about the adventures and journey of this book. Again, just for those, just as a refresher here, the title of the book is called Waterfowl of the World. If you go to GaryKramer.net, you can look at sample images of the book. Go under books, you'll find that title, and there's quite a few sample pages. I'm thankful for that you had those samples just to kind of get a taste of what the book is like. I would say be careful. If you look at it, you're probably going to want to get one. But 167 species of ducks, geese, and swans. I thought the list would be longer than that, Gary. I thought there'd be more than 167 species.
Yeah, what the thing is that when I started this, you have to find some biological location, because you could probably debate how many species there are in the world, but the International Ornithological Congress is a worldwide organization. And according to that authority, there's 167 full species. So that's where that number came from. But then within each chapter, for instance, there's a chapter on Canada geese. Within that chapter, I do talk about the 7 subspecies of Canada geese. In the case of some of the others, there may be, 2 or 3 subspecies which get talked about in the book. So I just couldn't go further than that and try to do all the subspecies. That'd be crazy. But as far as full species, there's 167 based on that authority.
No, that's amazing. So you've been traveling, it sounds like, for many, many years, way before you decided to create this book. What was your inspiration for the book, Gary? Was it, hey, I want to go do this? Or was, holy cow, I have half the pictures. Why don't I go the rest of the way? What was your inspiration for creating this?
Well, I think a little bit of both. I had traveled quite a bit. And for instance, the North American species, I had all of them, really. I mean, I didn't have all the pictures of the quality that I wanted. So, of course, I photographed in North America a whole bunch to improve the quality of the images for this book. But I also had quite a few from South America and quite a few from Africa. Asia was the biggest hole because I didn't have much there. And Europe was pretty so-so. So I had a good start. But I think for me, it was just at this point in my career, as we've talked about, from the time, I was a kid and right on through, waterfowl has been an important part of my life, whether it be hunting, whether it be as a biologist, refuge manager with the Fish and Wildlife Service, or whether it be in outdoor communication, one way or the other. And there had been a book done in 1997, which did have all the species of the day. And that was by Frank Todd, The Natural History of the Waterfowl. And if you look at that book, which I've had for years and years, it was really the beginning of kind of the gold standard of the time. But you now have digital photography. And if you compare the photography in that book compared to today, not just mine, but anywhere, the quality is 1,000% better. The other thing too is that it had been long enough that the world has changed quite a bit in those almost 25 years. And especially with the status of these birds, like snow geese, 25 years ago, they weren't like today where there's so many of them, we have a spring season, right? And 25 years ago, some species that are endangered today were not endangered. So I think it was just a matter of that I had a lot. It was something that I felt needed to be updated. And then it's just something that I wanted to do. I wanted to, frankly, do something that nobody had ever done. And that is, go for the gusto and photograph them all. And, so that just that, plus at the end of the day, it was also a conservation effort, because the way it works out is that I was able to get donations for much of the publication. So that allowed me to provide books to Delta, to California Waterfowl, to some of the other organizations, basically for free. And then they can sell the book. Half the money goes back to that organization for doing good things for waterfowl and wildlife, and half of it goes back to offset my travel, which was a whole lot of money. And I didn't get anything for that, but that came out of pocket. So at the end of the day, it really will raise money for wildlife. It doesn't matter, Audubon, any conservation organization that wants to sell it will end up, the book is $90 before shipping. They'll make 45, and I get 45 towards my travel. So it was a little bit of all those things that finally I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And I started in November of 17. And, it's been nonstop since. I mean, I haven't hardly photographed I have hardly photographed any species other than a duck, goose, or a swan in the last 4 years. And, I do lots of wildlife photography, but most of the other stuff went by the wayside.
I can only imagine. I read that 40 countries, 3.5 years is what the book description basically says. That's
Yeah.
an amazing, that's a lifetime. That's 10 lifetimes for most people, and you condense that into 3.5 years. That's pretty impressive. But I guess it goes to say what you can do when you're on a mission and you're inspired by
But
something.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, it truly was a mission. So I mean, I'd go to Argentina and I'd spend 10 days, which is pretty, the length of a typical trip was about 10 days. And then I'd come back, be in my office for a week, and then I'd go to Europe. Because the thing is, it was so seasonal in nature. You know, the northern hemisphere species, I got to be photographing in our winter, right? And then the southern species, you know, you have to photograph in their winter, which is the summertime, you know, June, July, and August, like in Argentina, Southern Africa. So there was really something to photograph every month. And I couldn't let too much time lapse because I had this self-imposed deadline of to get all the photos and to do all the writing of a max and then get it actually printed and delivered. And 4 years was my time frame. And then, of course, COVID came along, which made it even more incredibly difficult. But I still managed to get it done. So that's the good part.
So, how do you break down the globe? And I guess, small tangent here. I I love to just go out into the woods, into the mountains, into the prairie, and just soak in everything outside of hunting season. But I love to hunt everything. I do. And waterfowl have always, there's a magic behind waterfowl because you could spend 10 careers and waterfowl will always be challenging in the sense that they're an international resource. They migrate. Their range is so large, therefore their problems are so large. But I would imagine that the fact that most ducks migrate, and I would say globally most ducks migrate, did it give you an opportunity to? Uh, you said winter. You'd go somewhere during the winter. Was that an opportunity to get as many species in one location as possible? Or what was your strategy for capturing all of these species in a short amount of time?
Yeah, well, that's what I did. You're exactly right. What I tried to do is at first I looked at what I had, and then I kind of developed the fact that I had some holes in them. And some of them, you know, like northern pintail, I can photograph 7 miles from my house, and there's, 50,000 birds 7 miles from my house. So I would fit that in as I could. But the international stuff, I mean, for instance, two of the trips that I went on among all of the 40, there was actually more than that because I went back multiple times to some locations because I'd go once and didn't get what I want, then I'd go back the next year. So it was 40 destinations, but there was way more trips than that. Plus, I did U.S. a lot, I did Canada a lot, and I did Mexico a lot because they're relatively close by comparison. But for instance, the two best were Punta Arenas, Chile, where I went and spent 10 days, and that was a trip that was in late September, which is now their spring. And I was able to go there, spend 10 days, flew to Santiago and then to Punta Arenas and then stayed there, got a motel, rented a car. But everywhere I went, I had to hire a guide of some sort. I mean, there was a few places that I kind of did it on my own, but the majority of the time, you got to realize I'm going to a place I've never been before, oftentimes. A duck, goose, or swan I've never even seen. I have no clue what the weather's going to be like because these trips are planned way in advance. And then when I get there, I got to get close. So I ended up hiring somebody, oftentimes a bird watching guide, occasionally a photographer. And then occasionally it was like in New Zealand, it was biologists with the New Zealand Department of Wildlife that helped me out. And that individual then was allowed me to reduce my search time and go to find these birds. Well, in Chile, for instance, I ended up getting about a dozen species of birds in 10 days, many of which I didn't have anything of. And it was just one of those situations where the guide knew what he was doing. So he put me on the birds. I know how to get close, which is most of the birding guides are going to say, there's your bird, and it's 150 yards away because they're used to having a birder with binoculars that want to look at it quickly and then check it off their list and then they move on. Well, for me, we're talking 20 yards, even with a group, 50 yards starts to get too far if you really want to get a decent picture. So I had to use the techniques I've developed all these years to get close. And so that's what I try to do is pick locations where there was a lot of species, pick the right time of year. And then I got lucky. I can't tell you how many days I got lucky on weather halfway across the globe. So that kind of worked in my favor. Uh, and the only reason it could occur really is because of the internet. Think back 25 years ago, you're writing a letter, you're sending a thermofax or whatever it is. You have no way to communicate quickly. Whereas this way, I could find these birding guides. I could contact the New Zealand Department of Wildlife. I could contact people in Australia or South Africa. And oftentimes I'd get a response back, I mean, within 24 hours. And I could set the trip up. So the two things that made this possible were the the ability to contact people on the internet. On the internet, secondarily, the text itself is really just a gathering of hundreds and hundreds of pieces of scientific information, and then condensing them down into a format that somebody can understand and make it consistent. And then contacting these guides. And then the other thing is digital photography, because a lot of this was low light photography.
Mm-hmm.
That back in the day when you used slides, I mean, you just go home that day. Whereas under the current conditions with the technology we have today, you can shoot in a real low light and get good stuff.
I
So
suppose
all that kind of,
I suppose the knowledge that you did secure, digital photography also allowed you to know that you got a good photo.
exactly.
Where if you had rolls and rolls and rolls of film and you get back home, hopefully unless you developed it overseas, you're hopeful that you got the right picture.
Oh yeah, before when I shot slides for years. I mean, you get back from a trip with 100 rolls of film at 36 each. You wait 2 weeks for them to get developed, and then you get them all at once, and you're just hoping against hope they're all what you want. Because in those days there was no Photoshop. The horizon's crooked. It's crooked like this. You throw that photo away. Today you just straighten it up. So
Yeah.
digital photography made it much more feasible to do all this, along, like I said, with the internet.
Okay. So you understanding that you understand range maps. You're probably looking for breeding season. Obviously, you're looking for breeding season plumage. Advent of the internet, bird books. You know where to go. And I think that was I guess that was a pretty good point there that you said that in one location on one trip you were able to secure images or quality images of 12 different species. What about non-migratory species? Are there some non-migratory species that you encountered?
Yeah, surprisingly enough, the majority of the species in the southern hemisphere, whether it be Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Botswana, Chile, Argentina, many of those species are very resident. They make seasonal movements in response to habitat conditions, but they don't migrate like ours do. Now, there are some, in the northern hemisphere, a lot of our ducks, the majority of them, other than ones like maybe mottled ducks that don't move around much, move from the north to the south. Well, in South America, there's a whole bunch of species that don't move much, but then there's those species that will nest in the south and fly north for the winter. So you get that reverse migration. And then you get to other places where they're making seasonal movements based on water conditions. For instance, Australia was real interesting to me in the fact that when I went there, I went several times, but the first time I went, I'm going, okay, what time of year should I go to get these birds in good plumage? Well, once I did the research, which was not easy to find out, the fact remains is they don't have an eclipse plumage. Like our mallards, in August, they're brown. They've lost their green head. They're molting, and they're going to start getting their green head in the fall, and they're going to look like what we see during the hunting season. So the summer is called an eclipse plumage, and then the breeding plumage is in the fall and winter. Well, surprisingly enough, some of these Australian, New Zealand ducks, for example, they are in breeding plumage every day of the year. They never change. So that the fact is that, and the reason that occurs is that instead of them living in a climate where they fly north for the winter, where there's abundant north in the summer for the abundant food supply, and then fly south in the winter for food supplies, they respond mostly to water conditions. So let's say in the outback of Australia, you have this massive rainfall and flood. These birds somehow sense that, and they have to then fly to that area and they nest immediately. It's like an instant thing. So they have to be biologically ready every day of the year to breed when the conditions are good. You have 3 years of drought, they don't breed at all. So you have real interesting situations like that, particularly in the southern hemisphere and particularly in Australia and New Zealand. So the fact remains is you can go to New Zealand, Australia any month of the year and a chestnut teal or a pink-eared duck, which are two down there, are going to look the same every day. So that was like, wow, I don't have to worry about when I go. Now, there are breeding seasons that are more common than others. So you still want to try to get that for maybe some better courtship behavior and things like that. But the fact remains is that, and then there's a lot of birds in South America that don't have two different plumages. Like our mallard has a green head, the hen is brown, right? Many of the birds in the Southern Hemisphere, they look alike. So the male and female look alike. And then there's others that don't. So there's a real mix worldwide. It isn't all what we're used to. It's quite different.
That's fascinating. I'm learning a lot of this information. I really haven't had cause to learn anything outside of North America. So this is quite the education for me. Just ask you some random trivia questions, Gary, just to kind of, I can only imagine the series of adventures, maybe the follies that you experienced on some of these trips. What was your favorite location? Do you have one? Can you pick one?
Well, I would say probably my favorite location because, there's the really tough ones, which you never forget. There's the ones you have to go a real long ways that you never forget. But then also it's nice to have ones where you go a fairly long distance and it all pans out. The one in Chile was one, but the one that stands out for me that really yielded the most species with the best weather and it was easy to photograph was in Iceland. And I had a trip planned to Iceland originally in May of 20. Of course, COVID hit, right? And the world shut down. I mean, I had to cancel my reservations. I canceled everything. But what happened is that somewhere, maybe only 3 or 4 weeks before I was going to go, I ran across on the internet, I can't remember how, that Iceland was giving special permits for scientists, journalists, or movie crews. Apparently, they film a lot of movies there. So I wrote an email to whatever that email address was saying, I can qualify as a scientist and a journalist. I'm working on this book and I have a very finite period because in Iceland, what happens is it's a breeding area primarily. You get some species from Europe that go there to breed and some species from North America that go there to breed. So it's a real good mixing of birds in one location. So I sent the email. That was on a Sunday night. Monday, I get a response back from the Department of Foreign Affairs say your request has been received. The next day, 24 hours later, I get another letter say your request has been approved. And the third day, I'm talking 3 days, this is a government. Can you imagine that compared to most places in the world?
That doesn't happen.
It says you have a special permit to go to Iceland signed by the administrator for the Department of Foreign Affairs. So then I booked the only flight, which was once a week out of Boston to Reykjavik in Iceland. I fly there, show them my thing, my piece of paper. They say, you're the first American we've seen in months. How'd you get here? I ended up spending 10 days there, went back to the exact same place where I was going to stay, where I had a reservation for $800 for the week for the little cabin. Now it's $300 a week because there's nobody there. I was there 10 days. The photography was off the chart. Excellent. Everybody I met we're the first person we've seen from outside the country in months. And it ended up being, really an outstanding trip. And I got, some of the best images of species like harlequins, which we're familiar with, long-tailed ducks, Barrow's goldeneye. And then I got good species of European species like common scoter, Eurasian widgeon, things like that. So it was an amazing trip. That's probably my favorite because the way it all played out, it was really, and it was fun. The people were really, they were surprised, but yet, glad to see a few people from the outside. And normally the place that I went to, Lake Mývatn, is overrun with birders at that time of year, but there was nobody there with me. So it was like pretty cool place.
That's probably an experience that you can't recreate just from that perspective right there.
Exactly.
It'd be crowded. So I would imagine, I can picture you securing North American species photos. I can picture you securing those images in an urban environment if you so chose. I could see you going to a refuge. I could see you going to the Arctic in North America. So I can picture all of that. But when we're talking about overseas or South America, Asia, Australia, were you going to inhabited environments, or were some of these kind of remote areas that you were going?
Well, there was actually both. Um, as far as the remote ones, the ones that stand out that were really remote was I went to Madagascar to photograph the rarest duck in the world, and that took me 6 days of travel. I don't know, 9,000 miles. It was 3 days by air. I left it in the evening, so I count that day. Landed in Madagascar. First day was 10 hours on a paved road that was mostly potholes. The next day was 10 hours on dirt, and the last 40 miles took 5 hours. It was the roughest road I've ever been on. And this was all to find a single duck. I went there for, I ended up with three species, but I went there for a single duck, and that's the Madagascar pochard, which for about 15 years was thought extinct. They had not seen one anywhere. There were none in captivity. It was gone from the earth. And here, I think it was '07 or '08, there were some biologists from the Peregrine Fund out of Boise, Idaho. They're looking for an endangered raptor. They come on this remote mountain lake in Madagascar in the highlands, far from a village, and they see these ducks. They're going, wow, those kind of look like those ducks that are extinct. And then they went back to their bird books and got another couple people to look, and they said, lo and behold, those are the birds that have been extinct for 15 years, and they found 23 of them. So there were 23 left on the face of the earth. By the time I went, which was just a few years, which was a number of years later, they still existed in a single lake, and that's where I went. And there was about 70 individuals. So it took 6 days to get there, half-hour hike down to this remote lake really in the middle of nowhere. And then we jumped in a yellow canoe that there's some researchers had on that lake, and I got the first photo in the first 5 minutes. And I photographed them with impunity for the next 3 days, and probably have some of the only flying images of that particular duck, and a whole bunch of them for the book. And then at the same time, they had started a captive breeding program for some releases in other lakes to make sure that they didn't get wiped off the face of the earth again. And I went to that breeding facility and looked at that. So that was super remote, really interesting to be able to get really quality images of, what was something that didn't exist for 15 years. So that was a great experience overall.
Did you need special permission to I guess to access that particular lake, or were there not?
Well, I really, it was not as what I did is that the captive breeding facility was run by the Waterfowl and Wetlands Trust in the UK, an outfit called Durrell Wildlife, and then the Madagascar government. And I contacted some of those people ahead of time, and they just said, hey, we understand what you're doing, come ahead. So they didn't give me a piece of paper with a special permit, but I went through all the right channels to be able to access that area. So that's how that worked out.
Well, I'm gonna do a little reading on that bird. That's a neat story. For your sake, Gary, I hope most of your travels or all of your travels were safe and predictable. Did you run into any bumps in the road, any sketchy moments, or did it go as you planned?
Well, overall, I mean, at the end of the day, it ended up where there was really not a lot of issues, but I mean, there was a couple that were pretty interesting. One is that I was in Kenya, and one of the I had been to Eastern Africa numerous times, both on my tours that I go to Kenya and Tanzania, but also for this book. But the second time that I went, I was very, very specifically after one well, a bunch of species, but there's one that I was lacking, and that was the African black duck. And it's a riverine species found in swift mountain streams. You find them in pairs, they sell them in flocks, and they're not uncommon, but they're kind of hard to find. So I had a guide out of Nairobi that said, hey, I know the spot we can get them. It was right above a set of waterfalls, and there were some pools and rapid water. So we drive there from Nairobi, spend the night, get up in the dark, go down to the river just as the sun is coming up, and I see a couple birds at a distance, a ways off with binocs. And I said, wow, I mean, I got to get these things, let's go. He said, no, we can't go. I said, what do you mean we can't go? He said, we have to wait for the game rangers, the wildlife rangers to show up. I said, well, what do we got to do that for? This is killing me. These birds are down the road here. I got to get a photo. He says, well, kind of hesitate. He said, there's been 3 people killed by hippos. A rogue hippo lives in this river, And he goes, and we can't get near the river till the armed guards show up to make sure you don't get taken out by this hippo. So I said, okay, cool, then I'll wait. So the guys show up, two rangers, Kenya Wildlife Department rangers with their rifles, and they escort me down to the edge of the river. And I mean, they're 2 feet behind me, you know, almost like touching me as we're cruising along. And after about a half hour, they said, well, this hippo's not here today, so you're good. And they stayed with me the whole morning. I mean, a little bit further away, so they wouldn't mess up my photography. But that was the whole deal. I mean, it didn't end up being that way, but and if you know anything about Africa, hippos kill more people by a long shot than lions do, or elephants. Because what happens is, you know, people are going to the river to get water, especially the locals, and these hippos are up grazing. And when they see something in their way, they just take you out. I mean, it's all over with. So there had been 3 fatalities in the last month in that section of river. So there was a maybe, but obviously it didn't happen.
Yeah, I think I've not seen a wild hippo, but I think when you look at a hippo, I think one of the last things you think of, unless you hear of their reputation, you probably don't think of them as a threatening animal. But from the stories that I've heard, they certainly are. I had a question for you. You have a unique ability to answer this question, I think. North American model of wildlife conservation, publicly owned wildlife, not privately owned wildlife. That's the system that we live in and manage here in the United States and in North America. How would you compare other countries to North America in terms of game conservation or all species conservation, hunting, funding? Did anything really stand out? You know, should we feel fortunate to have what we have, or spend a little time on that?
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, if you look at third world countries, the problem is that hunting, which, as we all know, I mean, let's face the fact that us as hunters, we fund most of the wildlife conservation in this country. You know, people that are there's a lot of people that talk about it, but they don't put money into it. But we do as duck hunters, and as you know, whether it be Rocky Mountain elk, if you're a big game hunter, or Delta, if you're a duck hunter, pheasant forever, there's money that we put into the system. Most countries around the world, essentially, other than maybe a little bit in the UK, a little bit in Australia, and a little bit in New Zealand, the rest of the world doesn't have that system, because hunting is not a real hard tradition, particularly of birds. So you don't have any funding going into the game department. So really, they're kind of non-existent, or it's just lip service. I mean, I call it third world wildlife management, which is like they kind of don't know what's going on. There's no money going in. I'll give you a good example. In Argentina, for instance, I've been down there both hunting ducks and photographing them many times. And because myself and actually the second author that helped me on this book, Greg Mensik, who worked at Sacramento Refuge as a biologist, we were in Argentina, and the outfitter said, "Hey, you guys, are in the know on what's going on with some of this wildlife management stuff. I would like to get the local biologists here to meet you and talk with you." And we have so he set up a meeting. Well, guess what? That woman from she came from Buenos Aires, had to take a bus to the local town, the nearest town, had to go to the police station and check in to prove that she had made the journey. The outfitter picked her up. She had no car. She had no money for food. That she stayed with the outfitter. We met her. We talked about things. We talked about harvest surveys and all that. She had to go back to the police station, sign out, and get on the bus to go back to where she worked. So how do you work when you can't feed the people? They have no car, they have no gas, and you don't trust them enough where they have to sign into the local police station to prove that they got there. And I find that kind of, it's in many third world countries, that's kind of the case. There is some exception with big game hunting in Africa, which is relatively well controlled. And there is some money put in because, again, hunters put it in. But you're talking about birds, migratory birds or resident, you don't have much management and there's not much help. You have a handful of people trying to manage, and they don't do it at the level that we do. So we are super fortunate. People never get that until they've gone to some of these countries and see what it's like. So,
well, I think that's a perspective that I would love for more people to hear. I think it's hunters notoriously apathetic and typically don't fight for hunting until it's threatened. It's more of a reactive approach than proactive. And I would imagine that your world travels and your world view maybe puts you in a different mode than most other people. So thanks for sharing that with us for sure. So back to the book. What are the dimensions of the book, Gary?
Let's see. Let me just show you this book with this monster thing right here. If you can see it, it's a big coffee table book. I think it's 12 by 10 in size, and as I said, it weighs 8 pounds. But there was some thought originally of me doing it in 2 volumes. I mean, that was my own thought. But then I figured, I really want to have this as a single volume so people can go in. And the text itself is very, very consistent. So if you want to find out what the fledging period is, which is the length of time it takes from the egg to hatch until the bird flies, you can find that for all 167 species. If you want to know the color of an egg of a pink-eared duck in Australia, it's there. So that's the kind of stuff that I wanted to do. Then current status was real important to me too, to give some estimate based on what was available to where these birds stand as far as, are there lots of them? Are they endangered? Are there whatever? So I tried to do as much of that as I could as well.
Yeah, hardcover, and I'm looking right on your website, 12 inches by 10 and a quarter inches, 540 pages, 1,299 color photos, 167 range maps. What I liked about it, so there's beautiful Gary Kramer images, but you have a description of each one of the duck species or goose or swan species. You discuss their biology, their distribution, looks like range maps as well. But again, kudos to you for, I think, an often overlooked section, conservation and status. I think that's really important, just to open everyone's minds to, I guess the entirety of a species and its existence. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in that book. Anything that you'd really want to point out that I'm missing about the book, Gary?
Not really. Like, I think you just made a very good point. Is the fact that I think it's important for us to know where these birds stand. I mean, a lot of these are endangered species, and a lot of them they're plentiful. And I tried to get really up to date information to be able to look at that. And as I said before, which is repetitive, it really started out as really this. I'm going to create this photo book of all the waterfowl in the world, and there'll be some text. But as I got into the writing of it, it became more and more important to me to really make sure that the biology, all these different sections you just pointed out, were really complete for every species. And some of them I agonize over because there's almost no data. Mm-hmm. I mean, even there, a good example is a duck called a Heartlab's duck, which I had to go to the Central African Republic. I went there just for that duck. And there's never been a wild nest ever located. I mean, so some of that data had to come from captive birds, right? As far as how long is their incubation period, how long to fledging. So there's some species in the world. There's 6 or 8 species in the world that are so infrequently studied or not studied at all that even the basic biology was kind of a guess. And it was, instead of finding like a northern pintail or mallard, I can find thousands of references. On the Heartlab's duck, I found 3. So it made the full range. So that's the part that really I surprised myself with. And then once I got into it, then I was just, laser focused, dedicated. If I can't find out, what the color of the egg is, it was making me crazy because I needed consistency in every chapter. And at the end of the day, I eventually got it all. So.
Good for you. That's amazing. Do you have a favorite duck?
The thing is that there were some, northern pintail are super common as far as, especially in the Pacific Flyway. The guys that are in the East, they're going to be happy to see a few, but there's more pintails winter on the refuge I managed than in the whole Atlantic Flyway. So but I really do like pintail. And they have an incredible courtship display, in the spring, they really are great looking. And then, internationally, one of the ones I find really a very cool duck is a red-crested pochard. And it's a diving duck like a redhead found in parts of Europe and North Africa. And I photographed mine in Morocco, which was a very cool place to go. You wouldn't think there's any wetlands in Morocco, but there are some coastal wetlands that were really a great place to go to. So, and then there's a bunch of others. It's something many I had never seen.
The last part there, when that pochard that you just discussed, it's eerily similar to a redhead. Do you find, Yeah, there are some North American species that cross over into other countries, maybe at the extreme of their range, or very random um, travelers to different parts of the world. Do you find on opposite sides of the world? Do you find any similarities between North American species and other parts of the world?
Yeah, kind of what you find is that there's a number of circumpolar species, mallard, gadwall, northern pintail, northern shoveler. You find those all over, North America, Asia, Europe. There are circumpolar species. But what I found is that almost in every case, you will find what is pretty much the ecological counterpart of what we would have. For instance, the ecological counterpart of the mallard or the black duck or the mottled duck, which are all very similar in their behavior. In Australia is going to be the Pacific black duck. They quack like a mallard. They behave like a mallard. They'll feed in fields like mallards do. So the ecological niche, it seems like, was taken up by a similar species in the other continents. Same thing would go for, there's a duck called a hardhead in Australia. It is essentially looks like a scaup, like a bluebill or a scaup. So you have that. You go to Africa, you have a southern pochard, would be the ecological counterpart of our redhead. Same thing with teal. You find there's some like cinnamon teal are found in North and South America, but they're different subspecies. They're not one that migrates in between. So you do find these ecological counterparts all over the world that's filling that niche and kind of behaves the same. So that was, once I kind of clued up on that, that allowed me to take the behavior of what I was familiar with in North America, apply it to that species, like the yellow-billed duck in Africa, and kind of go to those habitats, look for them in those habitats, and use the same photo techniques that I might use here. So I was able to spread that worldwide and be pretty successful in getting the shots.
That's actually that makes a lot of sense. If you go back to, if you studied Pangea, the before the formation of continents, it makes sense, right? That a lot of these species were one at potentially at one point, and then differentiated over time, and so it makes a lot of sense for climate or latitude, longitude, that it makes sense that they would have things in common. So, but that's pretty neat, and you've seen them all. So we'll wrap this one up. GaryKramer.net. You can look under books, and you find Waterfowl of the World, and you have a choice: standard edition or limited edition. The standard edition, I see you have it priced to include shipping. If you live in California, it costs a little bit more than if you live outside of California, and even more if you live in Canada, but it's available to everyone anywhere. And then your limited edition is priced quite a bit differently, but that's available. That information's available on the website as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, the limit I did too. I did a standard edition, and then I did, which is the one that's $99 for most places in the U.S. postpaid. But I also did a limited edition, and the limited edition has a leather-like cover with gold embossed lettering on it, and it goes in a slipcase, and the slipcase has the regular cover on it, like you pull it out with a ribbon. And then it's numbered 1 through 250, and it's signed and numbered. So, and it's $250 for the majority of them. And that's kind of, at some point when I'm long gone, that'll be a collector's item. And surprisingly enough, I've already sold about half those, which I was expecting them to sell at about 100 to 1 to the others, but they're not. They're selling at far better percentage than that. So those seem to be somewhat popular. The standard edition I have in stock, and I've been mailing them for about 6 weeks now. The limited edition, we're caught up in the supply chain, and I'm supposed to get those this week. So the folks that ordered them will be getting their books, and I'm finally glad to be able to say that. So, but the standards I've been shipping out on a regular basis.
You're standing at the light at the end of the tunnel right now, Gary. Congrats on your book.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed the podcast. I did. Thanks for the discussion, Gary. Like I said, I think we could wander through some of your travels and stories, either your U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service career or your career as a writer and photographer. So I really appreciate you spending the time, Gary. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, I did. If anyone has questions, I think they can get your contact information on GaryKramer.net. Remember, that's Kramer with a K. Or, this podcast has a dedicated email address, podcast@deltawaterfowl.org. Send me the questions, comments, any of them for Gary. I'll send them his way. But I guess with that, Gary, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and safe travels to Brazil. Leaving tomorrow?
Yeah, tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow's on the plane again.
Well, have a safe travels and catch lots of peacock bass.
There you go. Hey, I appreciate the time so much and what Delta does. I mean, I've been involved with you guys for a long time, and if it wasn't for organizations like you, maybe we wouldn't have the waterfowl hunting we have today. So that's always a great appreciation from me.
Well, thank you, Gary. There's so much that's been done, so much yet to do, and I guess there should be people in seats like ours for centuries to come. The job will never be over.
There you go.
All right. Thanks, Gary. You take care.
All right. Thanks.
You bet. See ya.